Hello, I'm Tony Guida. This is My New York. Let's talk about the Gilded Age. Not the popular HBO series, but a similar drama that was playing out in Staten Island. That Gilded Age is captured in the photography of a woman who called herself Miss Alice Austen. Austen was a wealthy Staten Islander and an amateur photographer who also made acclaimed images of a rapidly changing New York City in the 19th century. But there are mysteries in Austen's life and her work, and my guest, art historian and curator Bonnie Yochelson, is here to solve them. Bonnie Yochelson, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Sketch us a little portrait of Alice Austen. Who was this woman?
Alice Austen was born right after the Civil War in 1866 and came of age in the 1880s, which was right into the Gilded Age moment. She had a very unusual background, actually. She was brought up by her grandparents. Her mother lived with her grandparents. She had a unhappy marriage and returned home when Alice was a little girl. But they were quite wealthy. Her grandfather was an auctioneer. And he had bought a home on Staten Island very early in the 1840s, right on the harbor, the water, and it's now a historic museum devoted to Austen.
Has it a name?
The Alice Austen House and Museum is, a wonderful place to visit.
Okay.
With an incredible view of the harbor. You can see everything from the Verrazano Bridge over to New Jersey from the backyard. So she grew up in this kind of magical place. And the first thing she did that distinguished her was that she was a competitive tennis player.
Really? At that time?
Yeah. Tennis came to America through Staten Island, through the Cricket and Baseball Club of Staten Island. And women were welcome. And she became a competitive player as a little girl. As a young woman. And there was actually a tennis court on the grounds of her home.
I think you have said that at that time Staten Island athletics were very prominent, and women had an equal place in those activities. Right. They weren't second-class citizens.
Yeah, which is a fascinating story. Staten Island was a suburb. It was, for Manhattanites, it was a 30-minute ferry ride across from Lower Manhattan. And families started to move there in the 1840s, and by the 1880s, there were a lot of very wealthy families that moved there, and that's kind of the Gilded Age piece. And they gave enormous parties and charity benefits and weddings, these big lavish events. But interestingly, many of them were organized around sports, around athletics, because there was this beautiful land. People built these large houses, but there were clubs of all kinds, and the community got together and supported these clubs. And it was actually the Staten Island's Ladies Club that sponsored the ladies' tennis tournament that was at the center of the social life of Staten Island when Alice was coming of age.
So this was her world, the Gilded Age.
Yes.
She was wealthy, she was socially prominent, she was a gifted athlete. You've referred to her as a conservative rebel. It sounds like a contradiction. Explain that for us.
Well, in many ways, there was a concept that took hold in the 1890s of the new woman, which was the athlete, the woman who was physically active, who wore less binding clothes. She was all that. So that's the sort of rebellious piece. It was very much accepted within her set on Staten Island, but she was a real leader and a real competitor. She also was a co-founder of the Bicycling Club of Staten Island. Oh. Bicycles were brand new. Bicycles, the so-called safety bicycle with rubber tires, became a huge fad in the United States in the 1890s. And again, Staten Island was at the forefront, just as they were with tennis and just as they were with women's athletics. So those were the ways in which she distinguished herself, in which she was kind of a rebel. She also, I mean, to move the story ahead, when she was in her 30s, she fell in love with a woman, and she had a woman partner, Gertrude Tate, for almost 50 years.
We'll come back to that relationship because it's central to who Alice Austen was,
Yeah.
and important even, you know, as a way of evaluating her photography. But I just wanted to go one step further on this conservative rebel idea. You've written about Alice that she believed in the presumed superiority of her class and race. That's a neatly constructed sentence that hides some things. Tell us what's behind that.
Okay, well, the conservative side, to just back it up a step, has to do with her relationship with her family, which was very defining for her. And especially because she was brought up by the older generation, she had this great rootedness to kind of mid-19th century American life. She was
Victorian. I mean,
yes,
a product of Victorian age.
Very much so. And that was very defining for her. And her home, which was a Victorian cottage, sort of state-of-the-art architecture and gardening of like the 1850s and 60s, which was put together by her grandparents, was absolutely central to her identity. And among her friends, she associated only with very well-to-do people, and within her class, there were, you know, biases that are hardly surprising. There was a sense of superiority. I mean, she was from sort of pre-Revolutionary War American stock, and that was very important to her. She just assumed that came about not because her forebears came first and created, you know, they worked hard, but they created social structures and legal structures that benefited them. That wasn't the way it was understood. It was understood as within her era. I mean, she grew up, remember, during Reconstruction. That there was a sort of moral superiority to her class of white, well-to-do people. And
I get the sense this was, as you're saying, is a superiority in a class of white, wealthy people, and people of color weren't either understood or welcomed in that crowd.
Right. She made assumptions based on the culture in which she lived and didn't challenge those assumptions.
Okay.
So you could say that in some ways she did challenge some assumptions, right? Because she was a very active athlete, and she was really out in front on, you know, on some of these, ways in which women would comport themselves in the world. But on issues of class and race, she was just accepting the context in which she was brought up.
How did she become interested in photography?
She grew up in a household full of photographs and photographers. Her grandfather was a very avid collector of photographs. There were photographs hanging in her house. There was a stereoscope, which is a big viewer of, there was a big tabletop viewer in the parlor in her house, and a whole collection, very large collection of cards that you would put in the viewer and see tourist sites. Mostly. Yeah. And her uncle, Peter, who grew up with her in the house, became an amateur photographer. And her uncle, another uncle by marriage, Oscar Muller, who was married to her aunt, was also an amateur photographer. Okay. So she was surrounded by this. And interestingly, all those photographers in her life were men, but she, as a woman, took up this hobby. And she took it up in earnest in the 1880s when amateur photography was another big fad. The same way she was into fads. She was really of the moment. She was very on trend. So when tennis was just coming about, she was right on the tennis. When bicycling was just coming about, she was right on the bicycling, and the same with photography. And she became really skilled. I mean, her collection, which is the basis of my research, which is at the historic Richmond town, is 7,000 prints and negatives. So it's a big archive.
Maybe we should just tell the viewers, if they don't know, what historic Richmond town is.
Historic Richmond town is a museum, public museum on Staten Island that consists of a large number of buildings that are historical buildings that were assembled there. Right. And where they have public programs, and it's also the home of what was the Staten Island Historical Society, which is where the collection is.
I have to confess, Bonnie, to lack of knowledge. When we first talked, and we talked about a Gilded Age on Staten Island, I was like, wow, I didn't know that. And
I didn't either. Yeah, so the historical arc of that is interesting because, as I say, in the generation before the Civil War, that's when Manhattanites started coming to set up house there as a kind of suburb, a sort of pastoral suburb of Manhattan. But in the generation after the Civil War, more wealthy people came who had a lot more money, and there was a lot of more they really put their money, the same as in that HBO show. It's sort of fascinating. It's not so much about how they made their money, but how they spent it. With really lavish homes and really lavish parties, all of which were written about in great detail in the press. And so, there was this scene there there was even talk of competing with like Manhattan's, 400, the famous 400 of Mrs. Astor. They saw themselves in direct competition. Let me just make one more point, which is that by the end of the 19th century, literally just by 1900, 1910, those families had left. Because Staten Island was becoming more industrial, more working class. The proximity to New York, instead of it being an advantage, as it was in the 1830s and 40s, became a disadvantage. Right. And with the coming of the railroads and the development of sort of the Hudson Valley and Long Island, the very wealthy people started moving there.
And Alice was photographing the kinds of balls and charity events and things among her friends, and those are her photographs, I guess, of the Staten Island Gilded Age. Who saw these photographs? Did she ever have exhibits?
No, she was photographed for herself, and her photographs would have been lost if, she photographed for her friends. She made albums for her friends. She used photographs as a kind of social tool. So, for example, when she went to visit a friend out of town and she took photographs of their home or of the landscape on her trip, then she would send them photographs as a thank you. Instead of writing a thank you note, she would send pictures. So that was how she showed her photographs at the time, through creating albums and giving gifts.
Well, let me ask you about something I said at the beginning, which is taken from your writing about Alice. There were mysteries in her work and in her life. I guess we could do 2 or 3 hours about that, but can you?
Well, there's been a lot of detective work involved in writing this book because there was one very excellent book written about her in 1976, and that's by a woman named Anne Novotny, who was actually a professional picture researcher, very much a field in the 1970s, a profession unto itself. And it was very good for the time, but there's just so much to revisit, which is sort of what I've been getting into.
And of course, it's 50 years old, that book.
Yeah, exactly. So it's unusual. Almost. It's unusual for someone who has maintained a public reputation through the Alice Austen House Museum that there hasn't been a reconsideration till now.
I think our viewers at this point, Bonnie, might be a little bit confused. Bonnie's working on a book about Alice Austen, which is going to be called Conservative Rebel. And as soon as it comes out, we want you back here. But what you should know is that Bonnie created a superb online exhibition about Alice, and it is available at
GothamCenter.org, which is part of CUNY Grad Center. It says exhibits on the main menu, and then you scroll down, and it's right there.
You should look at that while we await Bonnie's book, because it's a superb exhibition, as I said, which not only has plenty of text about Alice, but so many, 85 or 90 of the pictures are included in that.
Yeah, it's a kind of preview of the book.
Yeah. What would be, let's get back to her lesbianism and her life partner, Gertrude Tate. How important is it to recognize Alice's relations with women of her time, and I just mean social relations, to reckon with those in terms of reckoning with her photography?
Well, that's been a real challenge for me. She's become very well known since the 1990s for basically a handful of pictures. There's one very famous one in which she and two of her friends are dressed in men's clothes, sort of mugging for the camera, posing for the camera. There's another one in which she and her best friend, they're all her best friends, are in her friend's bedroom, dressed in their undergarments with masks on and sort of fake smoking cigarettes, like that they're sort of, they're women of ill repute. They're kind of, again, these are kind of set up pictures for the camera. Satire.
Yeah.
And some of these pictures have been interpreted as like sort of lesbian messaging. My understanding of them is not quite that Alice was extremely socially ambitious for many years, through the tennis and the photography and the parties. And by the time she took these pictures in 1891, she'd been doing that for like a decade and was starting to have kind of doubts about basically the kind of social rituals that she was engaged in, which was really aimed at mating, at marriage process.
Right.
So all of these social events was all about, getting engaged and getting married, which some of her friends were doing, some of them weren't. She was starting to feel that, I see these pictures as kind of satires of the sort of social rituals of her day and of the what she called the larky life, which was this social whirl of all these parties and sporting events and events that she was involved in, which she loved because she documented them all in scrapbooks and kept every single clipping. I mean, that's why it's so remarkable that this record exists, because you can actually trace her extremely busy, ambitious social life through these scrapbooks. But by 1891, when she took this handful of wonderful, funny, irreverent pictures, there wasn't, my view, and this is totally open to interpretation, was that although she may have had sort of feelings toward women, that these were her friends and she kind of just having fun, and that it wasn't until several years later when she actually met a woman who was politically radical and lesbian in 1897, a woman named Daisy Elliott, that she actually seemed to have discovered that aspect of her life. And then
later Gertrude Tate was her partner for life.
Yes, and then after this kind of relationship that she had with Daisy, that she, who kind of introduced her to the idea of romantic or sexual love between women, that she then met Gertrude right after that, and they ended up becoming a couple.
We'd be remiss, I think, if we didn't talk a little bit about a very important project of hers, which was New York street scenes or street people. Talk about
Which is still something I don't really understand why she did this, but shortly after she stopped taking pictures of the larky life, and her friends were getting married and having children, she started taking on some quasi-professional photographic projects. You said before, who saw her pictures? And I said, well, just her and her friends. These were projects that seemed to have, be more outward directed a little bit. One was actually commissioned. A couple were commissioned. She didn't have her name attached to them, so there wasn't, it wasn't like she was trying to develop a real career as a professional, but she was stepping outside her Gilded Age world. And at this moment, these pictures were taken in 1896, 5 years after those Larky Life satires that I just referenced. For about a year, she went into New York, which meant she was taking a fairly large camera. It was called a detective camera, but it was, 4x5 plates and, glass plates on a tripod. It was a lot of equipment.
She was schlepping like 50, 60 pounds of photographic equipment on the ferry. On the ferry and on the streets of
to
come to New York to take these pictures.
Correct. And so she did this, what she ultimately was a whole series of what she called the street types of New York, which were working class people. And it required her, she had to have had help with the equipment and also setting up the pictures, right? Because when you look at these pictures, it's an individual street type. Say a rag picker or a bicycle messenger or a policeman or a mailman or a street cleaner. In each case, the person is isolated on a streetscape. So she had to have help setting that up, keeping people away. I mean, this young woman, properly dressed with a camera had to have attracted a lot of attention. And she had to have someone help her not only carry the material, but set up the pictures. And so she did this. She took about 70 negatives, which are in the collection. And then 12 of them she chose to have printed in a portfolio with a portfolio cover that's kind of artistic, that's called Street Types of New York. And there's very few copies of it. There's no evidence of her ever marketing it, but it's as close as she came to actually doing a sort of commercial photo project.
Yeah.
And exactly what led her to do that, and the fact that once she produced the portfolio, it was kind of a 1 year, really intensive project, and then it was done. I still don't know why.
It raises, well, when I read about this and saw some of the photographs, I kind of thought about Jacob Riis, who of course was a social reformer and who dedicated his life to showing how the other half lives, the title of his book. We don't have an inordinate amount of time left, but can you talk a little bit about the Riis photographs versus Alice Austen's?
Sure. I mean, first I should say that, I'm an expert on Riis's photographs because I've written a complete catalog of his collection, which is in the Museum of the City of New York, where I used to be on staff. So I know that collection very well.
And you've actually written 2 books about
so
Jacob
obviously
Riis. Anyway, go on.
No, so of course, so I've thought a lot about this. And Riis's first pictures were actually taken a few years before Alice's. I mean, she wouldn't have seen them. But I would say the basic difference, so they're of the same generation. They are on the streets of New York photographing people of the working classes, immigrants. We have to imagine, for example, in the case of Alice, some of Alice's pictures, that she was dealing with people who didn't speak very good English, or perhaps, almost no English. I mean, she has a picture of Italian rag pickers. You can tell they're clearly, English would have been a very new language for them. But her point of view was, the very fact that she was photographing types, that these were not individuals. I mean, she was working with an individual, but they weren't individuals. They were there to represent a certain type. Suggests that it's creating an art project. There was actually a long tradition of what was called street cries, going back to medieval Europe, of these illustrations of people that worked on the street. So she's working, I don't think she had any great art historical knowledge, but it was a common trope. And so I think this portfolio was seen as a kind of art project and not as as you say, with Riis, where he was devoting his, life to social reform and to exposing conditions that needed to be remedied.
So it didn't end well for Alice because something happened in 1929 that we all, I think it's maybe happening again. The stock market crashed and she lost all of her wealth and actually her home.
Yes, her home, of course, belonged outright to the family, But she had mortgage debt during the Roaring '20s, and then she couldn't pay the mortgage. And so it's a very tragic story in which she and Gertrude sort of held on to the property, selling off the family mementos. Remember, her grandfather was an auctioneer, so she knew about selling valuable old things. Little by little, the house became barer, and they really struggled. And during the depths of the Depression, they actually had a tea room that was advertised in the New Yorker. Where Manhattanites would come, and Gertrude would make, meals, and they'd sit at tables with umbrellas out in the yard, looking at the harbor. I mean, they kept that going for quite a while. So they tried everything they could to keep going, but ultimately the bank, closed on the house.
Well, there's so much more, and the book is coming. Bonnie Yochelson's book about Alice Austen. But in the meantime, as I said, you should go to the Gotham Center website and look for Bonnie's exhibition. It's remarkable. You'll see the photographs. You'll learn a lot more about her. And I am thankful that you came here today to introduce us or reintroduce us to Alice Austen.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And thank you, folks, for watching. We'll see you next week.